Hot on the heels of the Liquid Freezer 3 series, Arctic is now trying its hand again with air coolers. This is the Freezer 36. It's a single tower solution. It's relatively fat. Does that for the fan solution. It's durable. And it forces a contact frame for intel, just like the Liquid Freezer 3 does, but we're gonna test and see if this one has a little bit better pressure distribution. This Freezer 36 cooler follows the prior Freezer 34 Esports Duo. Arctic also previously made the Freezer 50, which we hated.
I've been in here for 3 hours and I haven't even turned the computer on yet.
But this one doesn't make any of the mistakes that the Freezer 50 made, where it was strapping plastic appendages to a cooler and taking away from clearance for memory. And also just generally not a good idea to insulate a cooler with a bunch of plastic. So they've learned from the 50. Arctic tells us that the launch price of the Freezer 36 will be much lower than its official longer-term MSRP, similar to what happened with the Liquid Freezer 3. So for 3 months, they're saying that this cooler is supposed to be $27.71 on Amazon. Officially, this is a $52 cooler though, which immediately makes it less interesting than a lot of other things, like the Peerless Assassin at $35 or so, or some of the other incumbents. But we'll see how it does, and at least while it's at $27.71, it may be able to undercut Thermalright. And that's Thermalright's game. They've been playing the game of undercutting everyone for a while now. We actually asked Arctic to comment on this apparently new strategy. They sent this response.
Well, two can play at that game.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course we built a website for our CEO Snowflake because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. There's a lot of interesting stuff with this cooler today, but the most immediately different part is that fan attachment, where it snaps in with 4 screws on the back of the fan in the normal screw locations. They just use fat Phillips 2 screws and round heads that push into these plastic snap-ins, basically, to hold the fans in place. So it feels like this week has been sort of an exploration of mechanically interesting products. We had the Legion Go yesterday with the separable controllers, and now this. Now this Arctic solution is definitely in the reinventing the wheel territory, although it makes a firm connection and a satisfying snap. Is not a particularly wanting area of improvement in air coolers. The downside to this approach is mostly the relatively large trade-off in fin-to-surface area for the track that's provided, plus the deeper cut for the plastic pop-in locations. Public enemy number one for changing anything with fan mounting on air coolers is normally just, can you replace it if you need to in the future? The good news is they have built this in a way where it doesn't interfere with the replaceability of the solution, so even if the plastic joints in here break or something or snap, it is a separable screwed in piece that could come out and be replaced if you contacted Arctic for a replacement. Unfortunately, this works with any fans. There's a big upside. You could just screw these into the backside of another fan and theoretically it'll pop in the same way. But Arctic has this indent in the fan backside that helps to ensure a flusher fit. You'd probably lose that with most alternative fans, which might hover just off the surface of the heatsink. We'll give them credit though for a good design overall. It's trying to compete in the extremely budget end of air coolers, but also not, depending on which price you look at. So Arctic is definitely trying to fight Thermalright at the moment. We had a fight for your Thermalright to, I'll leave. The Freezer 36 is a single tower, but it's a fat tower, so this is relatively wide. The dual fan approach helps to resolve issues of maintaining pressure through this deeper fin stack, where this is a 54 millimeter wide tower. That's pretty big as far as single tower solutions go. So having both fans will help pull the air through faster, maintain that flow rate and the pressure through there. As a reference, the Deepcool AK400 is about 43 millimeters across to the 54 on this one, while the AK620, as an example, this is a dual tower, dual fan cooler, uses 2 towers that are both about 40 millimeters across. So the total size, total surface area is greater than what you get on the Freezer 36, but this is still significant compared to the more commonly 40mm or so single towers. One of the potential positives with this approach, other than maybe helping to control and keep the price down, is also just the total size. So it does end up being a little more compact in total. It's about 104mm across when you have both fans attached to it. So it does maintain a relatively stout overall posture for the cooler. And then for the cold plate, when we start looking at the bottom here, this is a simple 4 heat pipe design. So it's got 4 direct contact copper heat pipes that are exposed. The total contact patch of the Freezer 36 is relatively small at 31mm by 41mm, counting the aluminum part of the plate. And depending on how you count the staggered pattern you get on those heat pipes at the edges, that's enough to cover the most modern heat spreaders. The LGA 1700 CPUs are about 39 by 28 or so. AM5 is about 34 by 34. AM4 is about 37 by 37, give or take half a mil on all of those. We'd expect the Freezer 36 to have its weakest performance on both AMD platforms as compared to competing options that have a larger cold plate. And that's part of why for our testing today, we're looking at Intel and AMD alike. So we have LGA 1700 coming back, and that's also to test the specially made contact frame, which this is the only way to install this on Intel. So you will be removing the ILM, just like we talked about with the Liquid Freezer 3. It's an interesting direction that Arctic's going. Time to get into testing for this. So we're going to get into the thermals first. We'll look at AMD, Intel, and also cover the pressure distribution on both platforms. Then we'll go to Mike for installation instructions and his thoughts on the pros and cons of the mechanical aspect of installing the cooler. Our noise-normalized 200-watt heat load on AMD is first. This one has the Arctic Freezer 36 at 59 degrees Celsius over ambient, or about 80 degrees when factoring in our ambient temperature. That still gives plenty of headroom thermally for even cases on the mediocre side. And you can learn more about cases in our upcoming case reviews. Actually, the first one back in over a year is in just 2 days. ATX cases aside, the result has it about the same as the venerable Scythe Fuma 2, which was at one point the most noise to temperature efficient cooler on our charts. The reigning champion for best overall last year, the Peerless Assassin, lands at 56 degrees over ambient and maintains an advantage over the new Freezer 36. The primary differentiator between these will be looks and price. Arctic has shown that it wants to compete on pricing this year, so these two may be closer than previously. Another noteworthy entry is the AK620, a 2-fan solution that's almost 2 degrees cooler than the Freezer 36. So far, the Freezer 36 handled the heat load, so that's a good start. However, it has competition from several other dual-fan air coolers. In some respects, it has a slight size advantage if you favor slimness, as it's a relatively narrow heatsink with the single tower. If Arctic hits that $28 Amazon sale price for launch of this cooler like it told us, and we have no way of verifying that right now since we're filming before launch, then its biggest strength would be comparable performance, if sometimes slightly weaker, while being cheaper than most of these other options. Moving to 100% fan speeds, we unbind the cooler's fans to allow them to run as fast as they can. This eliminates noise equivalence, but it shows a natural point of differentiation. The Freezer 36 at 1861 RPM at about 39 dBA held a 57 degree result, tying it with the Dark Rock Pro 4, which was quieter, and the Geoshark JF13K, which was louder. The Fuma 2 remains one of the most acoustically efficient in this chart, but it's showing its age. The Peerless Assassin is up at 53 degrees, establishing a temperature reduction from the Freezer 36 of 3.3 degrees, but running louder than Arctic's solution. Our 123-watt heat load opens up the charts and adds a lot more air coolers. Here, the Freezer 36 held 56.5 degrees over ambient, which is about the same as the NHU14S single tower or single fan solution, so that's actually more impressive for Noctua than anyone else, and it improved on the Deepcool AK400. The AK620 dual fan cooler runs about 1 degree cooler than the new Freezer 36, with the Fuma 2 equivalent to the AK620. The Freezer 36 isn't bad, but it's not a chart leader. It doesn't get that same level of superlative positioning as the Liquid Freezer 3 series did. The Freezer 36 mostly tries to compete on price, at least initially, and on looks. For 100% fan speed on the 123-watt AMD heat load before moving to the Intel thermals, which are pretty interesting, the result positioned the 39 dBA Freezer 36 effectively tied with the Fuma 2 and the Assassin Spirit with 2 fans. The Peerless Assassin leads by 3 degrees on this chart, but the temperature range shrinks as the result of the reduced heat load. They get closer together, that's normal. The Freezer 36 is again not particularly impressive for thermals here, but it's also not bad. It's just okay. The result reinforces our earlier commentary, which is that this is more of a price or looks purchase than raw performance. There are better options for just pure performance, even at the relatively affordable end, although the sub $30 initial sale price makes this extremely competitive on cost. VRM thermals are really interesting on this one. With our 200 watt load and noise normalized, the Freezer 36 had the worst VRM thermals of the air coolers on this chart. It's still fine in that this VRM can definitely handle running in the 70s without even an ounce of concern, but the point is to see where that air is going. On a hotter board with a worse VRM, this is where a top or a rear fan in the case would benefit the MOSFET. In this instance, this higher temperature happens because the Freezer 36 is a straight-through funnel of air. The fans are flush against the single tower. Now, the dual tower design of other coolers allows some air to exit on its way through and hit the VRM, and not sinking the fans lower also means that all of the air goes straight in and out of the cooler and mostly over the VRM heatsink. Finally, we move on to Intel thermals. We ran a limited suite of a new 208 watt CPU package heat load with LGA 1700 to represent air coolers and test the stock ILM against the included contact frame. We did not test other contact frames in this benchmark, and instead stuck with whatever mounting hardware came with the cooler, as this is the most likely intended use. Of course, using a contact frame on a competitor would also improve its thermals. We've done that video in the past, though. Here's the chart. This tells an entirely different story, which is that the Freezer 36's contact frame really works. Rather than underperforming against the Peerless Assassin as in the AMD tests with stock hardware, it now equates the Peerless Assassin. We can prove why by looking at the pressure test momentarily. This frame levels the playing field significantly for Arctic on Intel specifically. And now, again, if you were to mount a contact frame for the Thermalright cooler also, it'd pull slightly ahead, but we've already proven that, and this is about the included hardware. The AK400 helps set the limitations of performance. It wasn't quite throttling, but it was borderline on it with the 72-degree delta T over ambient. The Corsair A115 is about 3 times the cost of the sale price of the Freezer 36, making Arctic and Thermalright look like a steal. We'll have a separate review of the Corsair cooler with full depth soon, though. But the frame works. The core-to-core deltas listed on this chart help to illustrate some of that point, where it's reduced from an 18 to 19 degree core-to-core delta on the other coolers to 16.8, which is closer to the A115. Let's look at how it's doing this. Up now, we're going to use our specialized mounting pressure analysis software and machine to evaluate the contact pressure distribution across the heat spreader. This looks at the quality of the mounting hardware. As always, this section of our review is sponsored by our Patreon supporters, so that's you all. Thank you to everyone who contributes and helps fund our efforts over on patreon.com/gamersnexus. It's our Patreon backers who helped us foot the bill to buy this equipment originally, and we've used it in almost every cooler review for years since. You can also go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to donate one time at the bottom of the page, or buy one of our brand new ultra comfortable hoodies with soft interior. Our solder mats are also a great way to support us and get something really useful in return, and they're almost sold out for this production run and won't be back for a little bit, so if you want one anytime soon, now's a good time to order. Here's the result for LGA 1700 on the Freezer 36. We did 2 mounts. The first on Intel here, you can see the heat pipes making high pressure contact with the IHS. This is exactly what needs to happen. That's where the pressure needs to be. There's a weaker spot toward the lower edge of the scan and on the second from the top heat pipe, but otherwise distribution is good. The second scan shows high pressure and even distribution across the entirety of the cold plate, with one exception up along the top edge. This is why Arctic is able to put up a fiercer fight with the Peerless Assassin 120 in our LGA 1700 testing than in the prior testing. As for AMD Contact Pressure, it's also good. AMD doesn't need a contact frame thanks to the overall flatter IHS design and lower flex of the substrate. The flatness, though, allows Arctic to evenly contact the IHS in most places. Its biggest weakness here is the heat pipes themselves, where we see lower pressure than the outer edges of the IHS. Ideally, the heat pipes would be lit up as higher pressure in this test. It's still good distribution. It leaves few areas unsupported, but it's not as strong as the specialized Intel mount. Enough of that. Now we're going to go over to Mike for the installation.
All right, so we're going to take a look at the Intel installation first. Just like the Liquid Freezer 3, you're going to have to use a contact frame if you install this on an Intel-based system. So their instructions for doing this outside of a case say to put a piece of foam or material under the board, and that is, of course, to capture the backplate that holds in the ILM. And then I've already got the CPU socketed, so I'm going to open this latch. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the stock ILM. This right angle wrench is included. It's a Torx T20 though, so you can use any T20 to take out these screws. Okay. So that's the stock ILM removed. Now we can go ahead and install the contact frame. The frame has a orientation triangle, just like the CPU. So I'm going to line it up with the triangle at the bottom left of the CPU and the bottom left of the contact frame. And that's my left, not your left. And I'm just going to start these 4 screws before I tighten everything down. Now this contact frame has 2 pieces of foam on the back of it. We've covered that. Maybe we can show a shot of that. But this is very similar to the Thermalright contact frame in the sense that it will make contact with your motherboard, and it's fairly easy and straightforward to install. I'm just going to keep walking these in until they're snug. I'm not going too crazy on the torque here. And that's nice and snug. Okay, so I can remove my foam now that the back plate is secure. Next step would be to apply the thermal paste. The orientation of this cooler matters. So you can see the text is readable, it's legible to me, just like it would be if this was in a case, an upright. The exhaust side has a indentation to allow for better fan efficiency for the exhaust fan that goes on the back of this cooler. So you're going to want that one facing towards the back of your case. And I'm just going to walk this in, alternating left to right. These can be tightened down until they stop or you hit a hard wall and bottom out. And that's the cooler itself installed. The final step, of course, is installing the fans, and we'll take a look at these in a second, but the installation for these is very easy. They snap right into place and are held in via tension from the plastic clips that I'm pushing them into. And that's it for the Intel installation, so let's move on to AMD. So first step, as always, is going to be to remove these stock AMD brackets. Next up is the 4 standoffs. And then the 2 mounting brackets. So you'll notice that if you watch the Liquid Freezer 3 video, the mounting brackets here are very similar. However, they do not have the forced offset that was present on the Liquid Freezer 3. So because of that, they are symmetrical, which means you can put either one on either side. Just make sure that these are tight. Next, we'll do our thermal paste. And then finally, I'll get this side started. And get this side started. And then I'll just go from side to side, tightening down in equal increments. And that's the cooler installed. We've already shown the fan installation, but I did want to take a second, and we could transition into the critiques and criticisms here. I really did like the fan retention system they came up with here. It's simple to use, and it's very easy to install, kind of almost easier than the standard clips. They're using a kind of typical plastic, coarse thread fan screw. However, it's got a very, very small shoulder on it. And that's what's allowing them to have this kind of like little claw, plastic claw on the cooler body that this is snapping into and retaining this screw. So that's a very, very cool addition. My only complaint about this cooler would be that you're you're forced to use a contact frame on Intel. I'd still like to see an option to use the stock ILM in case the user is not comfortable and they still wanted this cooler and didn't have to use the contact frame. But that wraps up the installation segment, and I'm going to throw it back to Steve.
We'll start briefly with the visual side of this. It is a matte black design. If that appeals to you, then great. There's an RGB option also. We didn't test that one, but you get the idea. It's got lights on it. The one thing that I wanted to point out specifically, though, with regard to looks, it relates to performance too, is the solution that Arctic used, and maybe one of the areas they've done a better job here, that's a really fine attention to detail aspect. that we haven't talked about is how flush the fans fit to this cooler, where there's barely a line dividing the cooler and the fan. That happens because of the way they're doing the 4-point mount in the corners, as opposed to, say, the metal clips that are more standard. Part of that is also because of the way the fan frame at the edges here is kind of indented to make that match a little more perfect against the actual heatsink. On the positive side, if you want to look at performance, this does help funnel the air straight through the cooler with minimal loss. So there's less sort of, we'll call it overspray, coming out of the sides, or you might have a little bit of a gap in more typical solutions, especially those that use the metal clip approach. So that is lost, allowing the air to just pretty much all get fed straight into the cooler. The sort of knock-on effect, or maybe unintended downside of that, is there's also less air finding its way down into the VRM heat sinks. And so this cooler, as we showed in the 200 watt heat load chart, ends up performing the worst in terms of VRM thermals for that limited set of data. And the VRM was still fine. It's not like it's doing poorly. It's the motherboard's job to have a quality VRM with MOSFETs that can handle enough current, with heat sinks on it if necessary, and handle that aspect of things. But it is nice to have some of that extra cooling boost from the cooler if you're using maybe a lower end board or one that's more borderline. In our situation, because it's a relatively good board and because the heat load is 200 watts from the CPU, this is not a factor. This wouldn't affect our purchasing if we were an end user and we'd look instead just at the CPU thermals. But it's something to be aware of, where if you are running a lower end board, which if you're on a budget, you might be, then you're not gonna get much help from this for the VRM thermals. However, mounting a top rear or a rear fan in your case will benefit the VRM just as much, if not more, in a lot of instances. So it's not like you can't solve the problem, it's just not gonna come from this, whereas with other coolers, we get some of that overspray, and especially those coolers that seat the fan down, and we'll talk about this in a video coming up, it's already filmed actually, where the fan sits down lower in the frame on top of the cold plate. That will cool the VRM the most. So anyway, that's one of the downsides. Now, performance was overall middling in the AMD set of tests. We'll keep our focus there initially, move over to Intel next. For AMD, it could handle the 200 watt load, which is great. So that's a good start. That is not true for every single tower cooler that we've tested. So some of them simply couldn't do it. They were overheating. We couldn't run them through the test. They got a big fat did not finish for those benchmarks, whereas the Freezer 36 is able to handle it. But it is, again, middling. It's not impressive. We're not blown away by it. It's not a bad cooler. It is capable, but boring in that respect. And so you'd be buying it in that situation, not for the performance, because it's not getting one of those Liquid Freezer 3 sort of best cooler we've reviewed statements. You would buy it instead more for the value with that initial sale price. Now, when that price goes away, if they ever do bring it up to the retail price that was listed, and we'll see, maybe they don't, because it would kind of might kill the product. But if the price goes up, it really does take away a lot of the potential value that it has right now, which is combining some of the finer looks that you lose on some of the true cheapest coolers in the market, but hitting a price point that the cheapest coolers would hit. It doesn't seem likely that they could keep holding that price and make any money. But we thought the same of Thermalright, and they're still there. So with the sale price, this ends up undercutting the AK620, which is here, AK400 a lot of times, the Thermalright Peerless Assassin a lot of times, the Scythe Fuma 2, so it's competitive. And as for Intel, the story's a little different. It's a little bit better for the Freezer 36. So performance on our just quickly built 208 watt heat loader is closer to 250 watts. You look at the EPS 12 volt cables, that has it significantly better than a single tower AK400, which we had on those charts as sort of a reference point for the floor. So in that test, the AK400 was just barely not throttling. You put it in a case, it's gonna throttle. So that was this is like the lowest end possible cooler you could put on that CPU we did for the testing. And this was significantly better than that, which you'd expect. It's a lot bigger tower. Compared to dual towers, it was roughly equal with the Thermalright Peerless Assassin. That wasn't the case in the AMD testing for reasons that are a combination of, on Intel, this contact frame is giving Arctic a sort of disproportionate advantage. And yes, you could do a contact frame for the others as well, but we're testing what's included. So that's part of it. The other part is on AMD. They don't have enough surface area in that cold plate, depending on which AMD generation you're looking at, to cover the entirety of the IHS. And whereas on Intel, it's more or less covered, and that's also helping to equalize the performance between the PA 120 and between the Freezer 36. On the charts, it was also encroaching on Corsair's new large cooler, and a lot of that again is thanks to the frame. But we think the Freezer 36 is much more competitive and interesting on Intel than on AMD based on our testing. Overall, this cooler, looking at the totality of everything we've talked about, falls into the camp of it's fine. It's not a bad cooler, but it's really not impressing us in total, like as a complete product. There are areas that impress us, but the entire thing is not, it's not just like a clear-cut victory in every regard, like some of Arctic's other products, like the Liquid Freezer 3 for the most part. So it is fine. If the sale price were intended to be a permanent price, and sometimes companies do end up doing that, we'll see. We'll have to wait 3 months and find out what they do. But if it were intended to be a permanent price, we would be a little more generous for sure on the praise of value, probably a lot more generous on praise of value. The trouble I have is I don't want to commit that hard to praising a temporary value if it's going to change in a couple months. So we'll see, but at the $50+ price, it's not that interesting. Again, it's fine, but there are much better options for cheaper in some cases. And at the $28, whatever it was, price, that's where it's actually definitely worth considering. Anyway, that's kind of it for this one. Not bad, not particularly exciting. The pressure was good though. They had a really great pressure distribution on both platforms, but especially with the contact frame. So maybe that's the biggest takeaway here, is that this more traditional design, as opposed to the flexing cold plate style of the Liquid Freezer 3, works better to conform to the Intel IHS in combination with this plate, and it worked out well for them there. So Arctic is, it's good to see them trying with air coolers again, because they've been less present in air coolers than they have been in liquid. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We have a lot of cooler reviews going on lately. We've been building up additional platforms, so you see the Intel one popping up now. We'll have some more too. So check back for all that. And also ATX case reviews are coming back this week. Is it tomorrow? I think the first video might go up tomorrow. So come check that out for ATX case reviews. We're really excited about it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.